Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems.
Вибачте, ну собакою, ну.
Що ви робите?
Яка квартира?
Что происходит?
Допоможіть, будь ласка! Допоможіть! Тварі на черемушках.
The Lib says, Russian bot slop. The mental gymnastics to argue that Ukraine should stop fighting people actively invading their country is insane. Russia is big and strong, whatever you say, Ivan. Of course, that's their go-to, Russian bot. Russia is the one that can't successfully invade a country 10 times weaker than their own. I say Ukraine is losing the war. It's not just suicidal empathy to keep supporting and encouraging her to fight on. It is homicidal empathy. I've been saying for 2 years that Ukraine needs to stop fighting, that we need to stop enabling her in this war. 2 years ago, the fabled Ukrainian summer counteroffensive ground to a halt as her best and most well-trained and well-equipped units broke upon the Russian defenses like waves upon the seashore. Since then, loss after loss has piled up. Ukraine has lost over 1 million of her fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands to this brutal descent into futility. Ukraine has been kidnapping thousands of civilians off the streets every month to replenish her ranks. Men typically survive 48 hours on the front lines after being thrown into the meat grinder with little or no training. There have been more desertions than deaths in the last year in a war that has claimed well over 1 million lives. This needs to stop. Further support and encouragement only leads to more death, more destruction, and increases the risks for a larger conflict. What started as a neocon exercise in diplomatic insanity quickly morphed into a neoliberal quagmire. Prior administrations fed this monster, and the Trump administration has been foolishly manipulated into following the same course. When will you all wake up? European leaders are talking boots on the ground, flippantly leading the Western world into World War III. He says, okay, Russia's also kidnapping people to send them to go fight in a foreign country, also completely untrained and unprepared. They promise payment to criminal and foreigners, then give them nothing when they return from the battlefield mangled. Actually, there is zero evidence that Russia hasn't honored its payments to its soldiers. And what's even more shocking is the fact that many people allege that Ukraine purposely misclassifies people as missing in action so that they don't have to make the payments to the family of the dead soldier.
Люди заробляють просто, неймовірні гроші на війні. Можливо, я буду не права зараз в якихось своїх твердженнях, але це, я ж кажу, я говорю тільки то, про що я чула, що зарплата військовим, вона відправляється на комбат. І дуже багато хлопців вважаються безвісті пропавшими, і про це знає комбат. І його обов'язок позвонити найближчому родичу, зв'язатися з найближчим родичем і відправляти, тому що зарплата на пропавшого безвісті, вона приходить. І він має відправляти це родичам. Припиняться виплати, коли він буде знати, що ця людина 200-ту. І сім'ї не знають про те, що їхні родичі загинули, а комбат про це знає, але не говорить, тому що йому за нього приходять гроші.
Це реальний кейс.
Реальний кейс.
There's bribes you have to pay from $10,000 to get your loved one out of the battlefield. And there's also you have to pay bribes to get the money into your account and to prove that you lost the family that you lost is your part of the family, even though you cannot identify them. So that's why they're pushing these legislations through to missing in action, so they can be put on only verified as dead after 2 years after the end of the conflict, because there's nothing to pay out, and Ukraine doesn't want to get involved in this situation. Say this is the reality that we're facing. The West will not finance this because the West doesn't need to pay out for dead soldiers. They need to only pay out to continue to fight this war. Ukraine lost more than 1 million soldiers already. And I can tell you, only 35,000, 65,000 families from that range of different sources, ranges that amount, were paid out of those million bodies dead. Can you imagine those ones that lost in the Kursk regions did not get paid out at all yet?
I've seen plenty of videos where Russians were beaten by their comrades for cowardice, killed even, Russians shooting themselves in the head to avoid drones. What about those lives? The lives of Russian men who don't even need to be in Ukraine in the first place. Men are only there because Putin sent them to die. They are fighting alongside North Korea, for God's sakes. How could you say that Russia is in the right? Never said that Russia was in the right. Actually, Russia is in the right. In January 1991, prior to the Alma-Ata Accords, Crimea held a referendum, the Crimean Sovereignty Referendum, where voters were asked whether they wanted to reestablish the Crimean Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic that had been abolished in 1954. Specifically, the referendum asked whether Crimea wanted to become an autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic as a subject of the USSR, not a subject of Ukraine. 94% of voters approved the referendum. However, Kravchuk, president of Ukraine, committed to prevent Crimea from seceding from Ukraine, visited Crimea on the day when its parliament was scheduled to vote on the law regulating the local referendum that was to be put the question of Crimea's succession to a popular vote. He convinced the former communist elite who had worked with Kiev since 1954 to postpone the vote on the law. Their opponents in parliament, represented by the Republican movement of Crimea, were outvoted. 1954 to postpone the vote on the law. Their opponents in parliament, represented by the Republican movement of Crimea, were outvoted. The Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland joined NATO in 1999. Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia joined NATO in 2004. Crossing Russia's red line. In 2008, NATO invited Ukraine and Georgia in for eventual membership, saying in a statement, NATO welcomes Ukraine and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. We agree today that these countries will become members of NATO. Albania and Croatia joined NATO in 2009. 2014, a failed trade deal set off the Euromaidan protests in Kiev, Ukraine's capital. This is John McCain taping the festivities from a hotel room overlooking the square.
What we're going to do is that every week a new delegation of the European Union and the European parties and the European Parliament shall come on this place until you have won your fight.
How did this suddenly morph from a protest into a revolution, as the protesters are calling, looking to topple an elected government?
It's not an easy job to topple the government, to change the president, to sign an association agreement, but this is our agenda.
In what many now call a coup, the president of Ukraine fled and a new government was installed. Montenegro joined in 2017 and North Macedonia joined in 2020.
We're simply asking them not to deploy their attack systems over at our home. What is so unusual or peculiar about that? So what would the Americans think if we, for example, decided to come to the border between, say, Canada and the United States or Mexico and simply deploy our missiles over there?
And what's the distance between the most northern part of Ukraine and the city of Moscow, Russia? A little bit over 400 miles. So if you think Putin would ever accept nuclear missiles 400 miles away from Moscow, you're insane. But that's another issue. entirely. You cannot convince people that Ukraine needs to submit to Russia and hand over their land, resources, people, etc. when the war could end at Putin's single request. No more Russians in Ukraine, no more deaths on either side. It's as simple as that. Additionally, Russia has already broken previously established treaties by invading Ukraine. If Ukraine submits, who's to say Russia won't move on to other targets with their newly acquired Ukrainian assets? I said, your argument lacks logic in a number of ways. Okay, Russia's also kidnapping people. I quoted them. First of all, that's not true. Russia has been inducing enlistment using huge payouts. Find one video of Russia's kidnapping their own citizens to fight on the front. You won't be able to because they don't exist. Find me one video of Russians forcibly detaining Russian civilians for military service in Ukraine. Search. While there's extensive reporting and video footage of Russian authorities conducting forced mobilization and rounding up men in Russia, as well as compelling Ukrainian civilians to fight for them in occupied territories, a war crime, the search results do not provide a single verifiable video of Russian authorities forcibly detaining Russian civilians for military service, specifically in Ukraine itself. And he said, I'll do you one better. Here's a video of Russian soldiers capturing foreigners for forced conscription. Just a little correction. This video actually takes place in Chechnya, which is part of Russia. I said, congratulations, you found a video. I can find thousands of videos of Ukrainians being kidnapped to serve. Thousands. And let me tell you, I am not exaggerating when I say I can find thousands of videos of Ukrainian military kidnapping Ukrainian civilians. There are thousands of videos. But this is a side argument that has no real bearing on the primary question. Ukraine can't win on their own. Do you propose that we send boots on the ground and start World War III? I ask again, since you seem to be hesitant to answer. If that is your view, why are you not at the front lines? I believe that if Ukraine concedes, Russia will just move on to the rest of Ukraine, Crimea, Belarus, Poland, etc., and we'll end up in World War III anyways. Russia has already broken treaties by attacking Ukraine, so I'm doubtful that it'll stop there. That is why I believe it's wrong to say Ukraine should end the fighting. Giving Russia a victory would only enable them further. Again, there would be zero more deaths on either side if they're not Russians or Ukraine. It is not their duty to give up their land, resources, and people just to get the Russians off their back. I propose that we, and most importantly NATO, funds Ukraine and provides them resources until Russia pulls out. My belief is that if war costs more time and resources than it's worth to Russia, they'll pull out, which wouldn't require boots on the ground or necessarily a Ukrainian victory. Additionally, if the Russian people stop supporting the war, they'll even be more likely to pull out. That is why I choose to say Russia should end the fighting rather than putting the blame on Ukraine for fighting for their independence. Think back to the Vietnam War. Would you tell the Vietnamese to stop fighting USA because we would obviously win eventually? He's not getting it. Ukrainians are facing catastrophic shortages in manpower, dude. This quote, Time magazine, is from Ukrainian government officials 2 years ago. In some branches of the military, the shortage of personnel has become even more dire than the deficit in arms and ammunition. One of Zelensky's close aides tells me that even if the U.S. and its allies came through with all of the weapons they've pledged, we don't have the men to use them. The problem has only gotten worse since then. All your arguments, which I vehemently disagree with anyways, are a mere sideshow. Only boots on the ground could save Ukraine. Drones, technologies can't take and hold territory. All the various wonder weapons in the world couldn't stop the Russians if you do not have the manpower. Everything else is academic. And I'm going to end this video with a clip that reiterates the entire point of my video and something we should never forget.
Я хочу умирать. Мне всего 23, помогите, пожалуйста.